Now to today's speaker. We are delighted to host Mr. Simon Coveney, who is the Taoiseach of Ireland, Deputy Prime Minister, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, who just arrived from Dublin and who is on his way to Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Beijing. And thank you to our former president, Scotsman, but with an Irish grandmother, Eric Wish. Okay. So thank you to Eric for arranging this lunch for us. It's all the nicer to host you, Mr. Coveney, that our club has a small, albeit dedicated Irish constituency who surely supports our finances through a consistent consumption of Guinness, as well as other beers that we offer downstairs. Mr. Coveney has 20 years' experience of national politics. He was first elected to Parliament aged 26, and he has since held key opposition portfolios, as well as senior cabinet positions, including agriculture and defense. He was also a member of the European Parliament 10 years ago, 2004 to 2007, a useful experience, I guess, to the key role he now has in leading the Brexit negotiation with Britain, including, of course, seeking a resolution on the Irish border. Please welcome Mr. Coveney.
Thank you, Florence, President of the FCC, distinguished guests, friends of Ireland. I know there are some of you here. It's a great honor for me to be here this afternoon in this iconic Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong. When you walk in the door, you feel like you're part of history. And it's a privilege for me to be here today representing the Irish government. I want to convey St. Patrick's Day wishes. Bonachty na Féile Pádraig to each of you. Happy St. Patrick's Day. It's a little bit early, but I know that there was a St. Patrick's Day ball in Hong Kong last Saturday night. So hopefully some of you are still struggling to recover from that, and that it was a good night. Today marks the start of a week-long visit to China for me, beginning with Hong Kong and continuing on with Shenzhen, Shanghai, and then Beijing, as Florence has said. It's a time of year when many members of the Irish government travel across the world to meet with members of the Irish diaspora, and I hope my visit also, though, indicates the importance which the Irish government attaches to our cultural, political, and economic relationship with this part of the world. It comes at a particularly relevant time as the outcomes of the 19th Party Congress take effect, and with a range of important political meetings taking place in Beijing this month. We're seeing an increasingly outward-looking and confident China on the world stage. I'm keen to hear at first hand what this means for Ireland, what it means for Ireland, for China, and of course the wider world, and to share Ireland's perspective on a range of bilateral and international concerns. In this context, I'd like to speak to you today about three topics, if I may. First of all, Ireland's long-standing relationship with Hong Kong. Secondly, our engagement now with China, which is changing by the year. And finally, I'd like to share our position with you on Brexit, which is something that I have a particular responsibility for within the Irish government. But at the outset, can I thank in particular Eric and Hilda and the Foreign Correspondents Club for the opportunity to join you here today, and of course your president also. As one of the oldest press clubs in the world, the FCC's work in supporting media professionals, championing the cause of press freedom, and providing a platform for open dialogue is as important today as it was when you were established in the 1940s. The FCC also had a long tradition of welcoming correspondents of Irish heritage, and I'd like to thank you for your work in helping those of us not fortunate enough to be based in Hong Kong to interpret at least some of what is going on in this part of the world. It's also a special honour for me to follow in the footsteps of a former president, Mary Robinson, who came here to the FCC almost 25 years ago. I'm not sure if there's anybody in this room who was there on that occasion, but I suspect there's a few. That was another era in Hong Kong, prior to the return to China and the introduction of the one country, two systems. The unique political construct which was devised to transition Hong Kong's reintegration back into China. The ambitious and in many ways visionary project has not been without its challenges, I'm sure. And the concerns of many people in Hong Kong through the Occupy movement reminded us of both the scale and that challenge and the need to demonstrate the benefits of the system to a new generation of people. Notwithstanding these challenges, Hong Kong's economic success, allied to the rule of law, media freedom, and openness, underpinned the Hong Kong Advantage, as it's called, which makes the city a leading financial centre and an attractive location for global firms looking to access this particular market, but more importantly, perhaps the broader region. I believe that the increased links between Hong Kong and the mainland, including the high-speed rail, bridge and airport infrastructure, the Great Bay Area developments, and its niche role in the Belt and Road Initiative will further secure Hong Kong's economic future for sure. It will also open many opportunities as highly skilled and talented young people with experience of a global hub that is Asia's world city in many ways, help to bring China's firms into a global stage. Our own connectedness with Asia will be transformed when Cathay Pacific begins the first non-stop flights between Hong Kong and Dublin in June of this year. In fact, this is the first direct flight between Dublin and Asia, which is amazing when you think about it, but it's true. And I think that Hong Kong being the first city to do that is so appropriate for so many reasons. This is expected to be the very first direct flight, as I say, to the Asia region as a whole. All going well, this flight will bring more than 60,000 additional visitors to Ireland over the first year of operation. We believe that the route will enhance and positively impact on a range of sectors from financial services to food and beverage exports. There will also be a strong impact in terms of culture and people-to-people connections as Ireland and Hong Kong further develop what is a natural partnership anyway. There's already about 5,000 Irish people living, as you know, in this great city. Ladies and gentlemen, in many ways, it is very appropriate that the first direct air link between Ireland and any city in Asia should be right here. After all, it's a city which was profoundly influenced by Irish-born people dating back to the time of Henry Pottinger, the first governor of Hong Kong in the 1840s. Right up to the present day, Irish people have played roles in the development of this city, particularly in the fields of business, law, education, and social services. 9 of the 28 governors of Hong Kong have had Irish connections. Many thousands of Irish men and women served in the colonial administration, including in the Hong Kong police force, with a particular special connection to Newmarket in my home county of Cork, recently chronicled by Patricia O'Sullivan. The Irish have also made an extraordinary contribution to the evolution of the education, health and social service sectors in Hong Kong, and this is something that is deeply appreciated. Ireland is very proud of the contribution of Irish missionaries from the Presbyterian, Anglican and Catholic faiths who've spent their lives here building education infrastructure. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the Columban mission to China, which, along with the Lasallian and Jesuit orders, have made significant contributions to the lives of so many families in Hong Kong. These missionaries have followed in the path of St. Patrick, and have left in their turn strong religious, health and education institutions which are now managed and staffed by the people of Hong Kong themselves. While Ireland's relations and links with Hong Kong are long-standing, our political links with China are more recent. And next year will mark the 40th anniversary of the opening of diplomatic relations between the two countries. Our embassy in Beijing, led by Ambassador Owen O'Leary, who's here with us, and our Consulate General in Shanghai, led by Teresa Healy, here in Hong Kong, and of course by Peter Ryan, our consulate here, are working hand in hand with all members of Team Ireland based across China. These include representatives of the IDA, Enterprise Ireland, Board BIA, which is the Irish Food Board, and indeed Tourism Ireland. Our relations with China have been transformed during those 40 years, as we've got to know one another better, including through a series of high-level visits in each direction. These include the visits of the then Vice President Xi Jinping to Ireland in 2012, and indeed President Higgins to China in 2014. We have developed excellent cooperation in both business and culture sectors, leading to increased numbers of young people in Ireland studying the Chinese language. The opening of 2 Confucius Institutes in Ireland, the flourishing of Irish cultural activities in China, and many, many other examples. I believe that our peoples share many characteristics, not least a strong attachment to family, a unique cultural heritage, and some difficult historical experiences. Our economies have undergone rapid transition from developing to fully developed status, from a closed economic model to one which is open and which supports a rules-based international system. This system has served Ireland well, and we play an active role at a global level contributing to this system now, including through our membership of the United Nations and the European Union. As I've mentioned, we are following with great interest political developments in China, following on from the 19th Party Conference last October, and are interested to see how we can engage with a more active China on the world stage. Later in my trip, I hope to get a deeper insight into some of these developments. I will also convey Ireland's welcome in principle and support for the Belt and Road Initiative, which will be central to China's international engagement in the coming years. As an island nation, Ireland understands better than most the importance of better connectivity. And I must say that personally, I do admire the ambition and the openness of this plan. Ireland welcomes the inclusive approach that China has shown in the development of the initiative, and we look forward to cooperating both bilaterally and on multilateral frameworks where appropriate in the coming years, particularly through the European Union. We welcome Ireland's commitment to the further opening of its economy, and we're working hard with Enterprise Ireland, which is our agency to help our Irish firms abroad to ensure that we take advantage of that and that we build the partnerships where they're offered. Indeed, we in Ireland understand from our Chinese counterparts that everything that we're doing together in the area of connectivity is already complementary to the aims of the Belt and Road Initiative. In this regard, one might consider Ireland as the westernmost point of the EU to the Belt and Road. And I would hope that we would find a solid basis for innovative cooperation in the context of this initiative as we move forward. I believe that we can build cooperation across the entire range of bilateral activity, and I hope that we can boost cooperation in fields such as financial services, education and tourism. Economic ties between Ireland and China have never been better. Given the positive news that we've seen in the areas of trade and investment, the headline figures are now particularly impressive from our perspective. Total trade between Ireland and China in 2016 was in the region of €13 billion, and we expect the figure for 2017 to be well above €14 billion. This would represent a doubling in two-way trade since 2013. 60% of this trade is in physical goods, such as high-tech equipment, and dairy product. Clearly, trade at this level requires the highest level of connectivity between both countries. Given the distance between our two countries, perhaps the most important form of connectivity will be reliable air connections. Ireland is already connected fully to its European neighbours, North America and the Gulf, but to date we have not had the air link that we want with this part of the world. Thankfully, as I've already mentioned, this is about to change with the opening up of air links between Ireland and Hong Kong later this year, as well as the potential for direct flights between Beijing and Dublin. These links will certainly contribute to greater people-to-people exchanges and enhanced connectivity overall, and are an example of our ever-increasing bilateral relationship. Let me turn to Brexit and maybe talk to you directly rather than read a speech in relation to Brexit, because it's something that I hope you'll have some questions on, but I have very strong views on. The first thing can I say is that when the British people voted to leave the European Union, it was something that was not welcomed in Ireland. We believe this is a mistake. Of course, from an Irish perspective, we believe it is, but also from a British perspective. I'm somebody who has spent nearly 4 years of my life in Britain. I was in university there. I worked for a while in Edinburgh. Much of my mother's family are very British. One of them voted for Brexit, I think. The one I don't talk to anymore. But having lived in Britain, I can understand why people voted the way they did. There are many people in England in particular who feel that the European Union was compromising British sovereignty. And their view was and is that Britain can be stronger and more effective and more successful without being part of the European Union institutions. And let's wait and see how that works out. But from an Irish perspective, the decision has huge implications. We have a €65 billion trade relationship east-west between Britain and Ireland. 38,000 companies in Ireland trade with Britain every single month. That's 200,000 jobs. It's 10% of the Irish workforce. And the numbers are the same on the other side of the Irish Sea in Britain. That's about €1.3 billion every single week. But it's not just the trading relationships that are potentially being threatened here. Because on the island of Ireland now, given the fact that we have two jurisdictions on the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, the only land border now between the European Union and the United Kingdom will be on the island of Ireland. It's about 300 kilometres long. It's got about 260 road crossings and a lot of other crossings that aren't so formal. This year is the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, or as some would call it, the Belfast Agreement, which is the basis of a peace process on the island of Ireland. And perhaps the most clear manifestation of that peace process in terms of success has been the fact that the border on the island of Ireland has become largely invisible. There is no physical infrastructure anymore on that border. When you drive between Dublin and Belfast now, or between Donegal and Derry, you do not know when you're crossing from one jurisdiction into another. Every year, small farms in the west of Ireland produce cattle that are finished north of the border in Northern Ireland. Every year, farms in Northern Ireland produce 500,000 lambs that come south of the border to be slaughtered. Every year, 40% of farmers in Northern Ireland have their milk processed south of the border. And that's just agriculture. And so when people talk about the Irish border question and think of it only in economic and trade terms, they are totally missing the point. The point is that the normalization on the island of Ireland 20 years after a peace process that allowed people and communities to interact and work and get to know each other in the context of an all-island economy. We are not going to sacrifice that as a potential unintended consequence of a badly thought out Brexit strategy. And that is why the Irish government is so firm and clear in its views and is so firm and clear in terms of its part of the EU negotiating strategy, that the Irish border is going to remain invisible through Brexit. And the British government has agreed to facilitate that, but they just don't know how yet. And I don't mean that in any kind of a facetious or a patronizing way. It is very difficult to come up with an agreed political solution to prevent border infrastructure re-emerging on the island of Ireland if the British government's strategy remains as it is today, which is that Britain is not only going to leave the European Union and its institutions, but it is also determined to leave the single market and the customs union as well. Because if goods pass from one customs union into another, you have to have border checks. That's how international trade works. If goods moves from one single market into another, where there's a different regulatory environment between the two jurisdictions, then there has to be verification checks in terms of what rules apply and what don't. There has to be arbitration mechanisms when there's a dispute. That's how trade works. And so there is, unfortunately, a fundamental dilemma here, that on the one hand, we have a Brexit approach which is based on leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, and leaving the European Union as a response to how people voted, even though I don't believe, actually, that British people voted to leave a single market. I believe they voted to leave the political institutions that they felt was undermining British sovereignty. But that's a different issue. It's not me who's interpreting that, that referendum result. And so what we have in December is we have an agreement that was the basis of moving the Brexit process from phase one, which essentially was to establish the divorce agreement, to actually moving towards negotiating a future relationship agreement between the EU and the UK. And Ireland said we would not facilitate the move from phase one to phase two unless we had some kind of backstop or insurance mechanism in relation to the Irish border issue, because of the reasons that I outlined to you earlier. And so what we have now is we have a willingness from both the Irish and British government, and indeed the EU team as well, to look for an option A, whereby the British government, negotiating with the EU, can come up with a future comprehensive relationship agreement that can solve the Irish border issues and maintain an invisible border. In the absence of that, the British government has said that they would like us to consider an option B, where the British government have said that they will propose bespoke solutions or unique solutions to try to solve the Irish border issues. But in the absence of that not being agreed, what has been agreed is that the United Kingdom will maintain full alignment with the rules of the customs union and single market in order to protect North-South cooperation, the all-island economy, and the Good Friday Agreement. It is clear in black and white in terms of the political agreement of December. But of course that causes problems internally for the United Kingdom. And those who understand the politics of unionism in Northern Ireland will understand that only too well. If a different regulatory environment is applied to Northern Ireland as to the rest of the United Kingdom, people feel threatened by that. And this is the core problem of Brexit. It fundamentally raises identity issues in Northern Ireland between nationalists and unionists. And we have spent the last 20 years trying to break down those identity barriers successfully, part of which was the removal of any type of border infrastructure. And so the Irish government will remain protective of what has been achieved over the last 20 years, while at the same time, of course, trying to maintain a close relationship between Ireland and Britain, as we know we need to in the future. They are our closest neighbours, they are our closest friends, and we have shared at times a very tragic history together. And we don't want that relationship to go backwards. But let me be very clear on this. Ireland is not following the lead of Britain here. We will not be leaving the European Union. We do not think it's a good idea to go it alone. We believe that in the modern world, the way to get things done is in a multilateral setting. The way in which small countries in particular are heard and get things done and are noticed and protected is as part of alliances and part of unions, like the European Union and, in different circumstances, the United Nations also. And for me, that is why the British decision is such a tragedy. Because Britain is one of the great countries of the world. And it is deciding to go it alone. When actually, most of the great problems that we face globally right now can only be solved together through alliances, rather than countries in a nationalist way looking to go it alone. And I have to say that is why the most recent speech by the British Prime Minister was welcome for us in Ireland, because she was trying to reinforce the point that while Britain is leaving the European Union, they very much want to be part of Europe and want to be part of as many alliances as they can facilitate while leaving the European Union at the same time. But it's going to make it much, much more difficult for them to do it. So look, I don't want to, I could talk to you all day about Brexit, and you're probably getting that message. I think it's a bad thing, but I think our job in Ireland is to make the best out of a bad thing, and to protect Irish interests in doing that, and also to protect the Irish-British relationship, while at the same time we reinforce the point that Ireland will remain at the heart of the European Union, because we believe that that is best for us, and indeed the European Union also. Why do I say that here? Well, I say it here, I suppose, because we are remembering, of course, a British presence in Hong Kong, which ended, and now I think we are looking at a British presence in the European Union, which Britain has chosen to end in just over 12 months' time, and that is very regrettable in my view, but it's reality. And the challenge for politicians is to try to make the best for the people that they represent out of the reality of the political decisions that have been made. So look, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me here, and please feel free to ask any questions that you might like to ask, and I will. I'm told actually that there's some strong Brexiteers in the room, so I'm looking forward to your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for this very passionate and crystal clear presentation of Ireland's position on Brexit, and thank you also for your words of support to the FCC. Can I give the first question to Eric, and then please raise your hands so that we pass the mic in advance. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for the speech. I'd like to go back to the Good Friday Agreement. It's the 20th anniversary this year, and it's under pressure from two sides. You spoke about Brexit, but also, of course, the Assembly's been suspended for more than a year now. And you said, while we were having lunch, that there was an attempt to get it resurrected quite recently that failed. So you also said, again, identity has become a political issue in Ireland. Sinn Féin is putting pressure on to have the Irish language obligation, the requirement as part of the discussion to return to the power sharing agreement. So how concerned are you about the future of the Good Friday Agreement, and how do you see a way out of this? How's it going to survive these two pressure points?
Well, first of all, Northern Ireland is also my responsibility from an Irish government perspective. I've spent a lot of the last 9 months in Belfast. I am worried about it. It's something that I think about a lot. Unfortunately, the politics of Northern Ireland is driven by fear at the moment. We had two very, very difficult elections in Northern Ireland last year. One was the Assembly election for devolved local government, where nationalism made a very strong statement and voted for Sinn Féin, which is the more hardline of the two nationalist parties, which was about sort of exerting influence and making a statement. A few weeks later, there was an election for Westminster, and it was the response of unionism to that first election, where unionism decided to vote for the harder line Unionist Party because they felt threatened by Sinn Féin. And so you see the DUP and Sinn Féin are the two hardline unionist and hardline nationalist parties, are where people go when they feel threatened by the other. And so that creates polarization. And that makes compromise more difficult. And so since that second election, the two governments have been working together to try to bring initially the two hardline parties together, because without the DUP and Sinn Féin, you cannot form a devolved government structure in Northern Ireland, because that's the way the mathematics works in the context of the Good Friday Agreement. We spent 9 months doing that, basically sheltering the two parties from the media to give them time and space to be able to figure out compromises in many areas. For those of you who are Irish, you'll know the areas that I'm talking about: marching, flags, how we deal with legacy issues, how we deal with language and culture issues, how we deal with issues like the aspirations of some for marriage equality in Northern Ireland, which is very much available in the rest of Britain and in the Republic of Ireland, and so on and so forth. And there were two very difficult issues that were difficult to find compromise on. On the nationalist side, they were basically saying, look, unless the Irish language is recognised as part of Northern Ireland as an official language, then we are not being recognised as part of Northern Ireland. And if unionism cannot accept that the Irish language is part of who we are, well, then we can't go into government with unionism. And unionism responded by saying, well, we can't, this is a Sinn Féin ask, and therefore we can't be seen to be giving into it fully. And to be fair to both sides, they both compromised. And we did get the basis of an agreement in private and in confidence on all of the issues, including the Irish language issues, where there was an agreement to legislate, but in the context of legislating for what's called Ulster Scots and broader cultural issues as well. Unfortunately, when the detail of that private agreement began to emerge, it started to unravel. And identity-based politics began to take hold, and people were reading into it things that weren't there at all, saying things like, you know, the Irish language is going to be compulsory in schools across Northern Ireland, which was never even discussed, never mind agreed. And it unravelled 3 weeks ago. And so we're now back to square one, trying to rebuild trust and faith between the parties again. But the two governments will continue to try, and we'll start it again next week when we get back. And so I certainly have not given up on devolved government in the context of 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement. Without devolved government in Northern Ireland, by the way, effectively the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement don't really function in terms of North-South cooperation, joint ministerial councils, and some of the East-West cooperation between the Irish and British governments come under real pressure as well. So, you know, there are difficulties there. It's possible to overcome them, but it is going to be difficult. And Brexit, of course, and the stresses and strains of Brexit, particularly for both communities in Northern Ireland. For nationalism, they see Brexit as cutting them off from the Republic of Ireland, and therefore they feel isolated and abandoned. For unionism, they see it as a threat to the United Kingdom to treat Ireland differently to solve the border issues. And so that is in many ways polarizing opinion again, which makes life more difficult. And what complicates things even further is, of course, that the British government is relying on the DUP for its votes in Westminster in order to stay in government and to pass Brexit legislation. And that creates a dynamic and a relationship between the DUP and the British government that leads to nationalist parties in Northern Ireland feeling that they're not being heard and that the DUP is being prioritised, which of course causes further polarisation and division. So not easy, but if you think about it, 20 years ago, the issues that were solved and the compromises that were found were much, much more difficult than the job we have to do now. And I think we need to try and take inspiration from that.
Thank you. Next question. Please introduce yourself.
Well, first of all, may I thank you for a most informative overview. First of all, my name is Andrew Leung. I'm a guest of Joe Lakin here. I'm a China strategist. I used to represent Hong Kong in the United Kingdom. If Hong Kong was a country, I would be called ambassador. And afterwards, I handed over my job in London to Carrie Lam, after handed over to her in Hong Kong as Director General of Social Welfare. But I'm not going to ask you a question on how Theresa May is going to eat her cake and have it at the same time over the Irish border. I'm going to ask you a question on what I see as a rising tide of Sinophobia. You refer to the question of identity. This kind of phobia, in a way, springs from the feeling of China's encroaching on the values on the European Union. And amongst geopolitics. So a lot of the overtures, including the One Belt One Road, is now hitting the rocks somewhere. Let alone, of course, with the United States. This is actually what I see as a worldwide phenomenon as the Chinese state, the Chinese economy, a capitalist and state-driven economy with its own different values, which doesn't share a lot of the values in the West. So this feeds into a kind of xenophobia, sort of looking at China's investment much more vigorously, sometimes not welcoming this initiative. And how do you see Irish role in this? First of all, what's Irish stance on this wave of China's extension of China's investments, influence around the world? And secondly, what is the role of Ireland in the European Union in response to this rising tide of xenophobia?
First of all, I mean, I think that the changes that we've seen from afar in China over the last 10 years have been very welcome, by and large. I mean, of course, there are things that we will dispute. Issues around human rights, press freedom, and so on. You would expect that. Politics in China is very different to the European Union and the US, and so on. I know that in Hong Kong, of course, you're very close to that here. But on the other side, if you look at the interaction between a small country like Ireland and a huge global country like China, it has become a much deeper one over the last decade. I mean, I remember coming to China, 6 or 7 years ago as a Minister for Agriculture. And literally we were introducing businesses to each other for the first time. Coming to China was like exploring in a whole new world. And the trade relationship between Ireland and China was a tiny one, really, in real terms. Now China's, our largest market for infant formula. We'll probably sell 700 million euros worth of high-quality dairy powders for infant formula into China this year. We see our largest food company, Kerry, in partnership with Being Made, a Chinese company in a really important niche area here. So, since 2014, I think there's been 21 ministerial visits, Irish ministerial visits to China, including a Taoiseach, a president, and of course Vice President Xi Jinping in Ireland. The Chinese Premier was also in Ireland. Our Prime Minister was also in Ireland. So, I think that there is an opening up to the rest of the world. it's an opening up that's very different to the kind of opening up that you get from the United States or European Union, because China is different. And I think the challenge for us is to understand that, to try to create an openness to working with Chinese interests, but also not undermining European values in that context. And that is why Ireland, in the context of its relationship with China, is very much part of an EU collective in terms of future trade relationships and so on. But you know, I don't think it's a sign of phobia, if you like. I think it's really trying to accept new realities, whereby, you know, global geopolitics is changing. You know, who would have thought that you know, that the concern in terms of protectionism and the introduction of new tariffs would actually come from the United States? You know, who would have thought that, you know, that a Chinese leader would be the one talking about the importance of barrier-free, tariff-free trade, which is what he was trying to do in Davos, not this year, but last year. So, you know, the norms as we expect them are changing. And I mean, Ireland is very close to the United States, and you know, our Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, will be in the White House this week. I was there 2 weeks ago, but certainly, foreign policy coming from different countries represents different types of threats right now. So, you know, I think that a China that's looking outwards is a lot healthier than a China that's looking inwards. That doesn't mean that there aren't some concerns and some threats. There are, but certainly Ireland sees itself as the most open economy in the European Union, arguably the most open economy in the world, and so we are and have seen much improved relations between Ireland and China. We don't see it as a threat, but we see it as an opportunity.
Well, unless that was a very pressing question, and I'd be tempted, well, I'll squeeze in a little last one,
Yeah.
even though it's almost
I'll
time.
give you shorter answers this time, maybe.
Thank you.
That
We'll
might
let
be
you
helpful.
speak a little bit above your time because you were so passionate. Well, we have less time for the questions. I was just wondering if you could see some kind of silver lining to this very black cloud that you're describing, because just as you mentioned that all the hurdles and obstacles that Ireland had to overcome in the past decades, could the unique role that Ireland is going to have once it's all settled, and the unique role and place, geographical place that Ireland will have within Europe, could actually benefit Ireland? Yeah,
I mean, undoubtedly there are some opportunities from Brexit for Ireland. I mean, we're going to become the only English-speaking country in the European Union. Well, it's true. I mean, my city, Cork, is going to be the second largest English-speaking city in the European Union.
Wow.
And there's only 200,000 people there. So, and I mean, on a serious note, I mean, I get phone calls from foreign ministers from all over the world to say, look, you know, until now, Britain was our friend in the European Union in terms of trade talks, in terms of you know, EU regulations, in terms of opportunities and supports around development aid and so on, trying to influence European institutions through Britain, because of course Britain had a very significant say and was one of the big five in the European Union and so on. And they're now calling Ireland and saying, look, can you be our gateway politically now into trying to influence EU policy in a way that takes note of our concerns or our interests. And so Ireland's role in the European Union, I think, will change. It's one of the reasons why we're significantly beefing up our diplomatic missions all over the world. This year, Ireland will open a new embassy in Santiago in Chile. It'll open a new embassy in Bogota in Colombia. It'll open a new consulate in Vancouver in Mumbai. Vancouver in Canada, obviously, in Mumbai in India. We'll open a new embassy in New Zealand. And we'll probably open another 5 or 6 new embassies next year. And we will significantly beef up our embassies in Paris and Berlin. And we will be looking for new partnerships within the European Union to try to compensate for the loss of Britain. And within the European Union, don't underestimate this. Like, the European Union is the lesser for Britain not being part of it. Britain was and is this great bulwark against protectionism within the single market. In fact, I would say that Britain is the chief architect of the most successful trade project ever globally, which is the single market of the European Union, which is an extraordinary success, which is why it's just so crazy that Britain are choosing to leave it now. But in the absence of Britain, Ireland will need to work with other like-minded countries, particularly Nordic and Baltic states, Benelux countries, the Netherlands and Luxembourg to a certain extent, to make sure that the kind of British and Irish thinking in terms of promoting globalization, ensuring that the EU doesn't start looking inward in the future, it doesn't actually happen. But undoubtedly, I think in terms of foreign direct investment, Ireland will look like a very attractive place in the absence of Britain being an option. But that being said, there's a lot more downside than upside to Brexit, unfortunately, for Ireland. And we will work to try to minimise the damage of Brexit, both for Ireland and for Britain, because we want a good outcome for Britain here. A strong British economy is good for Ireland. A strong political, close relationship between the EU and the UK is good for Ireland. And we'll work to try to convince our counterparts and our friends in Westminster that is the course of the direction that they should be taking in terms of the negotiations, because there's a lot of goodwill towards Britain in the European Union. If only Britain would ask for the kind of relationship that can keep the UK and the European Union together from a trading perspective, then I still think it's possible.
Well, thank you very much, Minister, for this fascinating presentation. A very happy St. Patrick's Day to you and to all the Irish people here, and please join me in thanking the Minister.